I didn't realize my coworker was quietly building a case against me until the day my own boss started repeating words I had only ever said to him in private. 3 months ago, everything at Hawthorne Analytics felt predictable in the best way, the kind of predictable that makes you think you're safe. I had my corner desk on the 12th floor overlooking about 6 blocks of downtown Chicago. I had my color-coded planner, and I had a routine that started with a large cold brew from the cafe across the street and ended with me shutting down my computer around 6:15 p.m. on the dot. Ryan Mitchell sat directly across from me, close enough that if one of us stretched too far back in our chair our knees would almost bump. We were both senior analysts, both up for the same promotion that would come with a 10% raise in an office with an actual door instead of a glass divider. Back then, I thought of him as competition in the healthy, corporate way, the kind where you joke about who's going to win, but still share notes before a big presentation. Ryan was easy to like. He had that calm, steady voice that made clients nod along on Zoom calls, and he never seemed rattled, even when a spreadsheet crashed 5 minutes before a deadline. When I stayed late, he stayed late too, the glow from our monitors reflecting off the dark windows like we were the last 2 people in the city still awake. If I ordered Thai food to the office, he'd Venmo me for half without being asked. If he grabbed coffee, he'd bring me a medium with oat milk, exactly how I liked it. That's why, when the first small thing happened, I told myself it was nothing. It was a Tuesday, just after 9 a.m., and I noticed an email thread about the Morrison account, one of our biggest clients, sitting in my inbox forwarded from our manager, Daniel Harper. The subject line read, "Updated Timeline," and as I scrolled, I saw Ryan's name, Daniel's name, and 2 executives from Morrison, but not mine. The original email had gone out the night before at 8:42 p.m., while I was at home folding laundry and half watching a cooking show. Ryan leaned back in his chair and said, "Oh, I thought you were looped in already," like it was the most natural oversight in the world. I smiled and said, "No worries, because that's what you say in an office when you don't want to look defensive." Still, I felt a small, unfamiliar shift in my chest, like when you miss a step on the stairs but catch yourself before falling. Over the next week, little things like that kept happening. A meeting got moved up by 30 minutes, and somehow, I was the last to know. A data model I had built was presented in a team recap without my name mentioned. Daniel started asking me questions about delays I didn't recognize, referencing conversations I hadn't been part of. Each time, Ryan had an explanation ready. Must have been a calendar glitch. I assumed Daniel told you. We were just brainstorming, nothing official. And every time, I nodded, because none of it was dramatic enough to justify suspicion. Offices run on misunderstandings all the time. Emails get lost. People forget to hit reply all. I told myself I was overthinking it, that stress from the upcoming promotion review was making me hyper-aware. After all, Ryan still laughed at my jokes. He still asked about my weekend. He still slid his chair over when we reviewed quarterly numbers together, pointing at my screen and saying, "You always catch what I miss." If someone had told me then that he was carefully rearranging the narrative of our work behind my back, I would have defended him. I would have said they were reading too much into normal office politics. Because at that point, I didn't see a threat. I saw a coworker I trusted, a shared goal, and a straight path forward. I didn't know that path had already been quietly redirected, one email at a time. By the second week, the changes were subtle enough that I could still explain them away, but frequent enough that I started keeping mental notes without meaning to. It began with Daniel stopping by my desk less often. He used to lean against the glass divider with a cup of black coffee and ask how the Morrison projections were shaping up, but now he would pause at Ryan's desk first, speak in a lower tone, and then walk back to his office without making eye contact with me. One afternoon around 3:30 p.m., Daniel called Ryan into his office and shut the door, something he rarely did unless it was performance review season. I told myself it probably had to do with the upcoming promotion decision, which was only 3 weeks away, but when Ryan came out, he did not look stressed or defensive. He looked composed, almost reassured. He caught me glancing up and gave me a quick smile. "Just going over strategy for the Morrison renewal," he said casually, before I could even ask. That was the first time I realized he was anticipating my questions. Later that day, I opened the shared drive to update our financial forecast model and noticed that a section of the Assumptions tab had been modified. The revenue growth percentage I had calculated at 8.4% had been adjusted down to 6.9%, and a comment in the margin read, "Revised per discussion with Daniel." My name was not attached to the revision history. Ryan's was. I scrolled back through the timestamps and saw the edit had been made at 7:18 p.m. the night before, well after I had logged off. When I asked him about it, keeping my tone light, he shrugged and said, "Daniel thought your projection was a little aggressive. I told him you would probably agree once you saw the new market data." I did not remember agreeing to anything. I did not even remember seeing new market data. But again, none of it was dramatic enough to confront. It was the kind of corporate gray area where decisions happen quickly and credit blurs. Still, I began to notice how often Daniel referenced conversations that I had not been part of. During our weekly team meeting, he said, "As Ryan mentioned earlier, we need to be careful about over-promising to Morrison." And I felt heat rise in my face because I had been the one who originally built the forecast. I waited for Ryan to clarify that the model was my work, but he simply nodded, hands folded on the conference table. After the meeting, one of our colleagues, Megan, gave me a polite but distant smile and said, "Tough feedback in there, huh?" I asked what she meant, and she hesitated before saying, "Just that Daniel seems concerned about the timeline you proposed." The timeline I proposed. I walked back to my desk replaying every conversation in my head, trying to pinpoint where my words could have been reframed. That evening, I stayed until almost 8 p.m., long after most of the office lights had dimmed. Ryan packed up around 6:30 p.m., telling me he had dinner plans, and wished me luck finishing the revised forecast. Revised. The word lingered. I opened my sent emails and reread the last proposal I had sent to Daniel, checking for anything that could be misinterpreted. It was thorough, cautious, and clearly labeled as a draft pending discussion. Yet somehow the narrative forming around it painted me as overly confident, maybe even careless. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the small square panels like they might offer a pattern I was missing. Maybe this was normal competition. Maybe Ryan was simply advocating for himself more aggressively than I was. But as I shut down my computer, and the floor fell quiet except for the hum of the ventilation system, one thought settled in with uncomfortable clarity. The story about my performance was changing, and I was not the one telling it. The following Monday, the office felt different in a way I could not measure, but could absolutely feel, like the air pressure had shifted overnight. I arrived at 8:15 a.m., 10 minutes earlier than usual, determined to get ahead of whatever narrative was forming without me. Ryan was already there, which was unusual, typing with a focus that looked almost performative. He glanced up briefly and said good morning, but there was something calculated in the timing, as if he wanted me to notice that he had beaten me in. I sat down, opened my laptop, and saw a calendar invite for a Morrison Strategy Sync scheduled for 11 a.m. The attendees were Daniel, Ryan, 2 senior directors, and me. The description read, "Aligning on execution concerns." Execution concerns. My stomach tightened. At 10:47 a.m., while printing out updated slides, I overheard Ryan speaking softly near the break room. I did not intend to listen, but I heard my name clearly. "I just worry she is taking on too much," he said, his tone calm, almost sympathetic. There was a pause, then a quieter response I could not make out. "Exactly," Ryan continued. "I think she means well, but the client cannot afford missteps right now." Means well? Missteps. The words sounded careful, like they had been polished. I stepped into the hallway, so he would see me approaching, not wanting to look like I had been eavesdropping. He ended the conversation smoothly and gave me the same easy smile. "Ready for the sync?" he asked. Inside the conference room, Daniel opened the meeting by discussing risk mitigation and client confidence. He referenced recent concerns about aggressive forecasting and communication gaps. He did not say my name immediately, but every example traced back to work I had touched. When I tried to clarify the assumptions behind my projections, Ryan gently interrupted, saying, "I think what Emily is trying to say is that the model was still evolving." Still evolving. It sounded unstable. I felt my pulse in my ears as I explained that the numbers had been clearly marked as preliminary, but Daniel's expression remained measured, analytical. The senior directors exchanged a glance that lasted half a second too long. After the meeting, Megan avoided walking back with me. Instead, she fell into step beside Ryan. I caught fragments of their conversation about accountability and leadership presence. Leadership presence. That phrase echoed long after they disappeared around the corner. By midweek, small social shifts became impossible to ignore. Conversations quieted when I approached the communal kitchen. Daniel began asking Ryan for updates on projects that I had initiated. An internal progress tracker listed Ryan as the primary point of contact for Morrison, a change I had not authorized. When I checked the revision history, the update had been made by Daniel 2 days earlier. I tried to replay every interaction objectively, searching for evidence that I had actually made mistakes. I reviewed my spreadsheets line by line, verified timestamps, double-checked email threads. The data was solid. The communication was documented. Yet the perception surrounding my work felt unstable, like sand shifting under a foundation. On Thursday evening, as I packed my bag around 6:40 p.m., Daniel stepped out of his office and said, "Emily, quick question. Are you feeling overwhelmed?" The word landed heavier than any direct criticism could have. I forced a steady smile and said, "No, I am on track with everything." He nodded slowly, as if weighing that against something he had already heard. "All right," he said, "just making sure." As I walked to the elevator, I realized the most unsettling part was not that Ryan might be competing more strategically than I was. It was that he was shaping concern around me in a way that sounded supportive. He was not attacking my performance outright. He was positioning himself as the stable alternative. And the more he framed it that way, the more isolated I felt, like I was the only one who had not been briefed on the version of me everyone else seemed to be discussing. By Friday morning, I stopped trying to convince myself that I was imagining the shift and started paying attention instead. I arrived just before 8 a.m., the city still muted in that gray early light that makes everything feel suspended, and I opened my laptop with a kind of quiet resolve. If the narrative about me was changing, I needed to understand how. I began reviewing every shared document connected to the Morrison account, not just the financial model but the meeting notes, the task trackers, the internal summaries Daniel forwarded to senior leadership. What I found was not blatant sabotage. It was subtler than that. In a summary Ryan had drafted earlier in the week, he wrote, "Emily proposed an accelerated rollout timeline, which may introduce unnecessary risk." Proposed. May introduce unnecessary risk. None of those words were technically false, but they were arranged in a way that emphasized caution around my judgment. In another document, he described himself as coordinating adjustments to ensure client confidence remained stable. Coordinating adjustments. As if he was the stabilizing force. I scrolled further back and noticed a pattern. Whenever a projection leaned optimistic, my name was attached. Whenever an adjustment was framed as prudent or strategic, his name appeared beside it. The work itself had not changed. The framing had. Around 10:30 a.m., I walked into the kitchen to refill my water bottle and saw Megan and one of the senior directors, Alan Brooks, speaking in low voices. When they noticed me, the conversation shifted immediately to weekend plans. Alan gave me a polite nod, but there was a new distance in his eyes, the kind reserved for someone whose reliability is under review. I returned to my desk and found a message from Daniel asking for a quick check-in at 2 p.m. My pulse quickened. During the meeting, he sat across from me with his hands folded and said, "I want to make sure you feel supported. There have been some concerns about alignment." Alignment. Another carefully chosen word. I asked what specific concerns he meant, keeping my tone even. He hesitated, then said, "It is just about pacing and communication. Ryan has been proactive in flagging potential issues." There it was again. Proactive. Flagging issues. I nodded slowly, forcing myself not to react emotionally. If there are specific examples, I would appreciate seeing them so I can address them directly, I said. Daniel agreed, but his expression suggested that the examples had already been discussed at length without me present. When I left his office, I felt something settle into place, not panic but clarity. Ryan was not accusing me outright. He was cultivating doubt. He was positioning himself as observant, cautious, responsible, while subtly attaching risk to my name. Later that afternoon, as we both worked quietly, he leaned back in his chair and said, almost casually, "Big decisions coming up soon. Promotion panels can be unpredictable." I looked at him and asked what he meant. He smiled slightly and said, "Just that leadership values steadiness." Steadiness. The word lingered long after he turned back to his screen. I realized then that this was no longer about a single email or a misdirected meeting invite. It was about perception management. Every conversation, every summary, every subtle comment was contributing to a larger picture where I appeared ambitious but unstable, capable but in need of oversight. And the most unsettling part was how reasonable it all sounded on the surface. There was no dramatic confrontation, no obvious betrayal, just a slow reshaping of how others saw me. As the office lights dimmed and the skyline outside turned deep blue, I understood something I had been avoiding. This was deliberate. And if I did not start documenting what was happening, I would soon be defending myself against a version of events that I had never agreed to. The following week, I stopped reacting and started observing. I arrived each morning with a quiet discipline, documenting everything in a private folder on my desktop labeled Personal Notes, a title neutral enough that no one would question it if they ever saw my screen. I saved email threads as PDFs, took screenshots of revision histories, and wrote down the time and context of conversations that felt strategically framed. It was not paranoia anymore. It was pattern recognition. On Tuesday at 9:12 a.m., Ryan forwarded Daniel an industry article about market volatility with a short message that read, "This supports the more conservative position we discussed." I had not been part of any discussion about shifting our position. At 11 a.m., Daniel asked me to update the Morrison slide deck to reflect team alignment on adjusted expectations. The phrase team alignment felt ironic. When I opened the shared presentation file, I noticed that a slide summarizing risk factors now included a bullet point that read, "Initial projections did not fully account for client sensitivity to timeline acceleration." That bullet point referenced data I had originally presented. My name was not there, but it did not need to be. Everyone in the room knew who had built the first model. Around lunchtime, Megan approached my desk and said carefully, "I hope you are not taking the feedback too hard. These things happen." I asked her what she meant, and she hesitated before saying, "There is just talk about being cautious at this level. Leadership wants someone steady." The same word again. Steady. It was as if a script was circulating and I had somehow missed the rehearsal. That afternoon, Daniel scheduled a brief call with me and Ryan to streamline communication. On the call, Ryan spoke in a measured tone about ensuring we present a unified front to clients and avoiding mixed signals. He emphasized collaboration, transparency, and shared responsibility. Listening to him, I realized how careful he was never to criticize me directly. He positioned everything as collective improvement while subtly implying that I was the variable introducing risk. After the call ended, I stared at my reflection in the dark computer screen and asked myself whether there was any truth to what was being suggested. Had I pushed too hard for growth? Had I overlooked something small that had now been magnified? Self-doubt crept in quietly, more dangerous than any accusation. That evening, I reopened my original forecast model and compared it to the adjusted version Ryan had helped circulate. The differences were marginal, less than 2 percentage points in projected growth, yet the narrative around them had shifted dramatically. One was ambitious. The other was responsible. On Wednesday, I overheard Daniel telling Alan Brooks that he appreciated Ryan's level-headed approach under pressure. Under pressure, as if the account were on the verge of collapse. In reality, Morrison had not expressed any dissatisfaction. In fact, our last client call ended with positive feedback and a clear path forward. The pressure existed mostly inside our office walls. By Thursday, I noticed that Ryan had begun copying senior leadership on emails that previously would have stayed within our immediate team. Each message was framed as proactive clarification. Each clarification subtly reframed earlier decisions. I realized that if I confronted him directly without undeniable proof, I would appear defensive, possibly even unstable, which would only reinforce the narrative he was building. So I chose silence. Not passive silence, but strategic silence. I limited what I shared verbally and relied more heavily on documented communication. If I proposed an idea, I followed it with a written summary. If a decision was made in conversation, I confirmed it by email. I watched how Ryan responded, noting the slight tightening of his jaw when I CC'd Daniel on updates. For the first time, I sensed that he was adjusting too. This was no longer subtle competition. It was controlled positioning. And somewhere beneath the surface, I could feel that something larger was coming, something that would force all of this careful framing into the open. The turning point came on a Thursday night when the office was nearly empty and the city outside our 12th floor windows shimmered with reflected streetlights. I stayed later than usual, telling myself I needed uninterrupted time to finalize the Morrison renewal summary before the executive review scheduled for Monday morning. Ryan had left around 6:10 p.m., offering a casual reminder not to work too hard, his tone light but unreadable. By 7:45 p.m., the floor was silent except for the low hum of the air conditioning and the occasional distant elevator chime. I was updating the shared executive brief when I noticed a notification flash briefly on the corner of my screen, indicating that another user had accessed the draft earlier in the evening. Curious, I opened the version history and scrolled back to a save timestamp at 6:32 p.m., just 20 minutes after Ryan had left. The editor listed was Ryan Mitchell. My pulse quickened. I clicked into that version and began scanning line by line. At first, the changes appeared minor, phrasing adjustments and reordered bullet points, but then I saw it clearly. In a section summarizing project delays, a new sentence had been inserted, initial timeline projections provided by Emily Carter. Required subsequent recalibration to align with realistic execution parameters. The phrasing was precise, deliberate, and unmistakably strategic. It framed my work as something that had to be corrected. I checked the comment thread attached to that edit and found a note Ryan had left for Daniel that read, "Incorporated clarification to ensure accountability is transparent at the executive level." Accountability. Transparent. The words felt heavy on the screen. I searched my inbox for any message discussing this addition. There was none. I opened the sent folder and found an email Ryan had sent to Daniel at 6:40 p.m., copied to Alan Brooks, summarizing the adjustments and highlighting what he described as necessary course correction. Attached was the revised executive brief, the same version I was now staring at. The subject line read, "Updated draft for Monday review." My name was mentioned only once, in the context of the initial projections that had allegedly required recalibration. I leaned back slowly, absorbing the weight of what I was seeing. This was not vague perception management. This was documented narrative shaping. The timeline told its own story. He had waited until after leaving the office, made the edits remotely, sent a summary to leadership without including me, and positioned the changes as responsible oversight. If I had not stayed late, I would have walked into Monday's executive review unaware that the framing had shifted again. I opened the document properties and took screenshots of the revision history, the inserted sentence, and the comment referencing accountability. I downloaded copies of both versions, labeling them clearly with timestamps. My hands were steady, but inside I felt something crystallize into certainty. For weeks, I had questioned whether I was overinterpreting normal competition. Now there was no ambiguity. The pattern was intentional. The consistency of the language, the careful exclusion from certain communications, the steady repetition of words like steady, alignment, accountability, risk. It all pointed in one direction. I imagined Monday morning, the senior directors flipping through the executive brief and pausing on that sentence, forming impressions that would linger long after the meeting ended. If I said nothing, the narrative would solidify. If I reacted emotionally, I would validate the very concerns being implied. I closed my eyes for a moment and listened to the distant traffic below, grounding myself in something outside the fluorescent glow of the office. When I opened them again, the fear had shifted into focus. I no longer wondered whether something was happening behind my back. I knew it was. And now that I had proof, the question was no longer whether I would respond, but how. That night, I did not confront him, and that was the moment everything shifted inside me. I shut down my computer at 8:32 p.m., slipped my laptop into my bag, and walked out of the building with a calm I had not felt in weeks. The cold Chicago air hit my face as I stepped onto the sidewalk, and instead of replaying every conversation in my head like I had been doing for days, I focused on strategy. If Ryan had been constructing a narrative carefully and quietly, then the only effective response was precision. Over the weekend, I reviewed every document again from home, sitting at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen, mapping out a timeline of edits, emails, and language patterns. I wrote down exact timestamps, who was copied on what, and which phrases repeated across summaries. The repetition was undeniable. Steady. Alignment. Accountability. risk. Each word appeared just often enough to plant doubt without sounding accusatory. By Sunday evening, I had organized everything into a clean folder labeled Morrison documentation, complete with side-by-side comparisons of the original executive brief and the altered version. On Monday morning, I arrived at the office at 7:50 a.m., earlier than usual, not to rush but to position myself. Ryan walked in at 8:20 a.m., coffee in hand, and seemed momentarily surprised to see me already at my desk. He offered a friendly greeting and asked if I was ready for the executive review. His expression was open, almost encouraging. Absolutely, I said, meeting his eyes evenly. I did not mention the edits. I did not reference the email. Instead, I sent Daniel a concise message at 8:34 a.m. with the subject line, Executive Brief Clarification, attaching both document versions and a brief note that read, I noticed adjustments made Thursday evening and wanted to ensure we are aligned on attribution before the review. Please let me know if you would like to discuss prior to the meeting. The tone was neutral, factual, and impossible to interpret as emotional. Within 15 minutes, Daniel replied asking to meet briefly at 9:15 a.m. In his office, he looked at the printed copies I brought, comparing the phrasing carefully. I was not aware this language was inserted without you being included, he said slowly. His tone was not accusatory, but it was thoughtful. I explained that I had no issue with recalibration if leadership agreed it was necessary, but I wanted clarity around how initial projections were being characterized. I kept my voice steady, measured, mirroring the very language that had been used against me. Daniel nodded and said he appreciated the documentation. There was a pause. Then he added, communication needs to be transparent on all sides. For the first time in weeks, that word felt balanced. When the executive review began at 10 a.m., I noticed something subtle but important. Daniel opened the meeting by referencing collaborative adjustments and emphasized that projections evolve as more data becomes available. He did not single out anyone. When the slide containing the recalibration sentence appeared, he clarified that the initial model had been strong but refined to reflect updated market input. Strong. The word landed like a quiet correction. Ryan remained composed, contributing where appropriate, but I sensed a slight recalibration in his posture, a carefulness that had not been there before. He did not interrupt when I explained the logic behind my original projections. He did not reframe my statements. As the meeting concluded, Alan Brooks thanked both of us for our diligence and emphasized the importance of unified leadership ahead of the promotion decision next week. Unified leadership. The phrase echoed differently now. I realized that strategic silence, paired with precise documentation, had shifted the dynamic without public confrontation. I had not accused him. I had not reacted defensively. I had simply placed facts where they could not be ignored. And for the first time since this began, I felt the balance tilt, not dramatically, but enough to know that the story about me would no longer be written without my awareness. After the executive review, the atmosphere in the office shifted again, but this time the change felt more balanced, less one-sided. Ryan did not approach me immediately, and I did not seek him out. Instead, we both returned to our desks and resumed work as if nothing unusual had happened, yet the silence between us carried new awareness. Around 1 p.m., Daniel sent a team-wide email summarizing the meeting and explicitly credited both of us for the Morrison model's development and refinement. The wording was careful, deliberate, and notably inclusive. I read it twice, recognizing that clarity had been restored in writing, which meant it now existed beyond interpretation. Later that afternoon, Ryan finally walked over and leaned lightly against the edge of my desk. His tone was measured. Good job in there, he said. You handled the projection explanation well. I met his gaze and replied, thank you. I believe transparency helps everyone. The word lingered between us. He nodded once, then added, we both want what is best for the account. It sounded cooperative on the surface, but I heard the recalibration underneath it. The dynamic had changed because I had made it clear that I was paying attention. Over the next few days, I observed subtle adjustments in his behavior. He began including me on email drafts earlier in the process. He referenced our joint input instead of separating our contributions. In meetings, he no longer paraphrased my points as if softening them for leadership. Instead, he would pause and say, Emily, do you want to walk through your reasoning? It was a small shift, but a meaningful one. On Thursday morning, Daniel called both of us into his office to discuss the upcoming promotion announcement scheduled for the following week. He spoke about leadership presence, consistency, and trust. As he talked, I realized something important. The competition had never truly been about spreadsheets or forecasts. It had been about perception under pressure. Ryan had tried to position himself as the safer choice by quietly amplifying risk around me. When that strategy became visible, it lost power. After the meeting, as we stepped into the hallway, Ryan stopped walking and turned toward me. His expression was calm, but more direct than usual. "I hope you did not think I was trying to undermine you," he said carefully. The phrasing was interesting. Not that he had undermined me, but that I might think he had. I held his gaze and answered evenly. "I think clarity is important, especially when leadership is evaluating us." There was no accusation in my voice, only fact. He studied my expression for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Fair enough," he said. That evening, as I packed my bag around 6:05 p.m., I reflected on how easily perception can shift inside a corporate environment. No raised voices. No dramatic confrontations. Just careful language, selective communication, and strategic framing. The difference now was that I understood the mechanics. I no longer questioned my instincts or dismissed small inconsistencies as harmless. I had learned that silence can either weaken you or strengthen you, depending on whether it is passive or intentional. As I walked toward the elevator, I felt steady in a way that did not rely on anyone else's description of me. The promotion decision was still days away, and the outcome remained uncertain, but one thing had changed permanently. I was no longer reacting to someone else's narrative. I was shaping my own, with documentation, composure, and an awareness that in a room full of professionals, the quietest strategy can be the most powerful. The promotion announcement was scheduled for Friday at 4 p.m., which meant the entire week moved with a quiet, restrained tension that no one openly acknowledged. By Wednesday, I noticed the office had returned to something that looked almost normal on the surface. Emails were inclusive. Meetings were balanced. Ryan remained professional and composed, and if someone walked in without context, they would see two capable analysts collaborating effectively. But beneath that professionalism, there was awareness. On Thursday afternoon, Daniel stopped by my desk and asked if I had a few minutes to talk. His tone was neutral, but steady. Inside his office, he closed the door gently and thanked me for the way I handled the Morrison account under pressure. He mentioned the documentation I provided and said that clarity and composure are leadership qualities that matter more than quick reactions. He did not reveal the promotion decision, but his words felt intentional. When I stepped back onto the main floor, Ryan glanced up from his screen, searching my face for clues. I offered none. Friday arrived colder than the rest of the week, the wind sharp between the buildings as I walked into Hawthorne Analytics at 8:10 a.m. The day moved slowly. Client calls, spreadsheet updates, casual small talk near the coffee machine. At 3:55 p.m., Daniel asked the team to gather in the conference room. The senior directors were already seated when we entered. I sat across from Ryan, our chairs about 3 feet apart, close enough to sense each other's stillness. Daniel spoke about growth, resilience, and the evolving needs of the firm. He acknowledged the Morrison renewal as a defining project for the quarter, highlighting collaboration, accountability, and clear communication. Then he announced that the promotion to associate director would go to me. The room responded with polite applause, professional but genuine. I felt the sound more than I heard it, like pressure releasing slowly. Ryan's expression remained controlled. He nodded once, clapped briefly, and offered a measured congratulations when the meeting ended. "You earned it," he said, his tone even. I looked at him and replied, "We both pushed hard this quarter." It was true. Competition does not erase contribution. Over the next hour, coworkers stopped by my desk to offer congratulations. Megan smiled more openly than she had in weeks. Alan Brooks shook my hand and said he appreciated the steadiness I demonstrated. The same word that had once been used to contrast me now described me. As the office began to empty around 6 p.m., I packed my bag and took one last look at the skyline from the 12th floor window. The city lights flickered on, steady and indifferent to the small dramas inside corporate buildings. I realized the outcome was not only about the title or the race. It was about understanding how narratives are built and how easily silence can allow them to grow unchecked. Ryan had tried to shape perception quietly, believing subtle framing would go unnoticed. What he did not anticipate was that awareness changes the balance of power. Walking toward the elevator, I felt grounded, not triumphant, but clear. Office politics will always exist. Ambition will always find strategy. But now I knew something I did not know before. When someone attempts to define you without your knowledge, the most powerful response is not confrontation fueled by emotion. It is documentation, composure, and timing. And sometimes, the quietest correction carries the loudest impact.